USS Wyoming was the lead ship of her class, the only class in US Navy service to be armed with a dozen 12-inch guns. And oddly enough, the class was the subject of the fourth video that the channel ever published. But today, we're going to look a bit closer at this particular ship as opposed to its class's technical specifications. Laid down in February 1910 and launched a little over a year later in May 1911, and commissioned in September 1912, by the end of the year, Wyoming had become the flagship of the Atlantic Fleet. But for the next half-decade, apart from fleet exercises and training cruises, the most militant the ship actually got was acting briefly as an overarmed troop transport in 1914 during the occupation of Veracruz. That would change, though, in 1917, when the US officially entered World War I, and as one of the most powerful US battleships that still used coal as a fuel source, as from the Nevadas onwards they used oil, which was not in overabundant supply in World War I Britain, Wyoming was assigned to Battleship Division 9, along with the Delaware, Florida, and New York, and then sent across the Atlantic to join up with the Grand Fleet as the 6th Battle Squadron. After some much-needed brushing up on gunnery skills, the US ships were part of a series of escort missions for convoys going to and from Norway, since the High Seas Fleet seemed to be loath to come out and fight the Grand Fleet at that point. Here, nothing much occurred except for occasional erroneous U-boat sightings, at least until the New York accidentally ran over an actual submarine and broke off a propeller in the process, leaving Wyoming as the US flagship while the New York headed off for repairs. While the battle squadron was expanded and its roster was slightly altered, Wyoming would remain on station for the duration of the conflict, and thus would be present for the surrender of the High Seas Fleet at the end of the war. Once the war was over, she headed back to the US, and the next year was reassigned to the Pacific Fleet, passing through the then still fairly new Panama Canal and basing herself in San Diego and San Pedro. This lasted for a couple of years before she was moved back to the Atlantic Fleet, and then in 1925 she was brought into dry dock for an extensive overhaul. New boilers, more deck armour, aircraft facilities, anti-aircraft guns, and a switch from coal to oil fuel were among the additions and changes made. Collectively, this added about 4,000 tons to her displacement when she was fully loaded, which also made the bulges necessary as much for additional buoyancy as for defence against torpedoes. After that, it was back to fleet problems and training, during which period somebody decided it would be really funny to assign the ship as the flagship of the Scouting Squadron, which otherwise was primarily made up of ships that were a good 10 knots or more faster than she was. But by 1930, between the naval treaties, her age, and her armament, most of the US fleet being armed with 14-inch guns or bigger, she was no longer considered to be a frontline warship, and after a few months in a battle division, she was instead made flagship of the Training Squadron. To qualify as a training vessel under the treaty terms, she had to lose her belt armour, 3 out of her 6 main battery turrets, and her recently installed bulges. But with this done, she settled in for a decade of training cadets in the art of running a battleship. But of course, with the end of the decade came the Second World War, and she was briefly assigned to the Atlantic Naval Reserve, but her rather limited capabilities were such that it was pretty clear that this assignment was a bad idea. Lacking belt armour, slow, and possessing only 6 guns of limited range due to limited elevation, even a Panzerschiff would actually have an advantage over her in a gunfight. So it was clear she'd either have to be modernised back to battleship standards, or put to some other use. The time and expense versus the payoff of modernising her was considered not worth it, and so she was instead returned to training duties, but now as a specifically gunnery-based training vessel. Soon, almost every available inch of her deck space was covered with examples of practically every anti-aircraft capable weapon in the United States Navy, ranging from single 30-caliber machine guns all the way up to single and twin 5-inch 38s. Also to be found aboard was almost every type of anti-aircraft fire control system. Operating mainly off the Chesapeake, she then went on to train job lots of anti-aircraft gunners in their new profession. In early 1944, this was taken a step further, and the remaining 12-inch turrets were removed and replaced with more 5-inch guns, as well as the latest fire control radars, expanding her training capacity for the standard US Navy heavy anti-aircraft gun. As the war ended, and having passed 35,000 or so anti-aircraft gunners through her, Although she'd never seen an enemy vessel or aircraft, Wyoming claimed the title of most rounds fired of any US Navy ship. Toward the end of the conflict, she was modified again to specifically look into anti-kamikaze tactics and continued working on new fire control systems in the immediate post-war environment. But with the battleship Mississippi joining her unit, and the latter being equipped with some of the newer US anti-aircraft guns like the dual-purpose 6-inch, the 5-inch 54, and the 3-inch 50 autoloader, Wyoming was judged surplus to requirements, and so she would be decommissioned in summer 1947 and sent to the breakers by the end of the year.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.